different perspectives on this. Give us a sense, 50,000 foot, what's the state of play right now in the space? Cybercrime, AML, KYC, where are we? How do you think about it? And how do we contextualize for people who may not be focused on this particular aspect of the space? Barry, why don't you just jump in?
Yeah, no, happy to. You know, what I love about the sort of backgrounds and really even just sort of hearing this initial part of the conversation is that, you know, we all focus a lot on illicit activity in crypto. And that is a lot of sort of what the focus is for regulators and law enforcement. And I spend a lot of time thinking about those issues and talking about them because that's what we do at TRM is sort of work to stop illicit actors. But I think all three of us are very much sort of, we're huge believers in this technology and this technology to bring financial inclusion and, you know, move remittances at the speed of the internet and bring banking to the unbanked. And I think what we all really believe in is sort of building that trust layer. And I think that's sort of the sort of unique backgrounds, unique companies that are really thinking of it that way, sort of how this whole thing works if you know, AML and security are critical infrastructure. And so sort of to jump into the question, you know, I think it's very early days, right? I think right now what we see sort of from the infrastructure bill on the Hill and all kinds of other things is the very, very opening sort of salvos in this much larger, longer conversation about what a clear legal and regulatory framework is going to look like for crypto. That said, it is a regulated industry. I think there's this sort of notion that there's no regulation and you hear the Wild West thrown around. But crypto businesses, by and large, exchanges and you know, crypto banks and you know, those who are custodying digital assets are regulated like money services businesses in the United States and really almost anywhere else that FATF provides guidance in the world. You know, a couple of weeks ago, I was on a panel and I used the term unregulated exchange. And some of my friends from FinCEN started blowing up my text messages, basically saying, no, every exchange is regulated. It's just sort of the level of compliance that they are sort of already baking into their infrastructure. So, you know, I hope that's a decent jumping off point, but I think we're very, very early days, but we are very much a regulated industry. And I think it's very important sort of folks to know that this is not the Wild West. There are strict regulations already in place.
Yeah. Amit and Justin are nodding in case you can't see. I'm kind of curious, Ari sets up this great framework for where we are in terms of public policy, regulatory infrastructure. I guess I'm kind of wondering, so what are the problems? What are the risks? What are the challenges we see today in the space? Jump right in, either of you.
Sure, I'm happy to. And I'll just take the perspective of just going back 20-ish years, right? When I got into the anti-money laundering, you know, illicit finance control space, especially within the context of the U.S. government and working with international governments, international standard setters for anti-money laundering. Ari had mentioned one of those key standard setters is called the Financial Action Task Force that sets global standards for anti-money laundering. For
the FATF.
The FATF, right? Yeah, for what money laundering controls, bank secrecy related issues, risk compliance, know your customer elements, who's obligated and why. And in 2001, you know, post the tragic events of 9/11, this space was put on steroids, you know, necessarily so, and not without, you know, the core intents of saying, okay, bad guys are moving value in a system that needs to be at least the exploitation of the system and the exploitation of people and their value needs to be controlled. And there's been obviously some overreach in terms of how those controls have been put in place and the breadth and depth of where those controls have been put. And without the understanding at that time of the massive innovation and evolution of financial services to now include an increasingly globalized peer-to-peer environment, a non-intermediary based environment. 20 plus years ago where you had to go to some intermediary if I wanted to send you value. I can now download an app off the App Store and you can do the same and we can transact the value. Who's your regulator? What jurisdiction do you like roll up in? And these are the heady issues that we are now contended with today. The other piece I would say is we are also trying to, you know, and other panels have talked about this, Perry-Ann's panel earlier talked about this, is that the pace of innovation in the sector is always going to outpace financial regulation and policy. That's going to be across the board in any sector. But the train has left the station, as it were, in terms of the crypto universe, the digital asset universe, and yet too many regulators are trying to stuff that train back into the station, but have to understand that that station no longer looks the same. And so regulation and the blueprint around who's regulated, why they're regulated, what their obligations are, must therefore necessarily change. And so not all are bank financial institutions or non-bank financial institutions. You can be a social media company. You can be a nonprofit. You can be all sorts of different types of organizations that effectively issue value, store value, send value, provide liquidity in some way. And in that environment, where do those obligations therefore fall?
Right.
And that falls on all of those players, right? Based on what those activities might be. And that's the nature of a modernized regulatory framework that we are working to implement. That has to be driven by incentivized self-governance controls and tools that can get to the very intensive, always going to outpace financial regulation and policy. That's all. That's going to be across the board in any sector.
Right.
But the train has left the station, as it were, in terms of the crypto universe, the digital asset universe, and yet too many regulators are trying to stuff that train back into the station, but have to understand that that station no longer looks the same. And so regulation and the blueprint around who's regulated, why they're regulated, what their obligations are, must therefore necessarily change. And so not all are bank financial institutions or non-bank financial institutions. You can be a social media company. You can be a nonprofit. You can be all sorts of different types of organizations that effectively issue value, store value, send value, provide liquidity in some way. And in that environment, where do those obligations therefore fall?
Right.
And that falls on all of those players, right? Based on what those activities might be. And that's the nature of a modernized regulatory framework that we are working to implement. That has to be driven by incentivized self-governance controls and tools that can get to the very intents that we all care about. I care that the system has integrity. I care that who you all are who you say you are. And I care that the value that I transact to you actually get to you. That's what we care about. And that's really the spaces that we're trying to solve for.
Yeah, very well said. And it's now a hugely broad spectrum, as you point out, of players in the space, not just traditional banking infrastructure. Just what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll take a different part of the question because I think these guys have done a great job of covering the pieces that they touched on, which is sort of, what's the state of crime and what's the state of fraud and sort of what's going on there. And look, the first thing I'll tell you, and I think that most folks will tell you the same thing, is that for 90% of our customers, they don't see high volumes of potential fraud. They don't see high volumes of criminal activity. They're providing financial services to people, and most people who are buying financial services aren't criminals doing criminal things. That said, there are challenges that we run into in this space. One, there's risks that are unique to the space, right? There's not another mechanism that allows people to send essentially unlimited value to any other person on the planet in a way which can't be intercepted in 10 minutes. And that creates new risks that regulators are concerned about. And while again 95% of our clients don't have fraud and risk issues show up, the ones that do see fraud attacks, frequently the people on the other side of the table are the Russian mafia, the Chinese mafia, and state level actors. And so the kinds of, frankly, adversaries that we run up against are frequently the really deep end of the pool. You can read stories about, like, literally you can trade Bitcoin in Russia and go dig up buried bags of money in order to do the exchange as ways to do cross-border money laundering for cyber crimes and other activity that's going on there. And so, regulators have very real concerns about the activities that are happening in the industry, at the same time that we, and they in many cases, want to ensure that all this innovation can continue to go forward, and that the controls that get put in place are controls that understand and take into account the decentralized nature of the network, and don't try and force into place that everything has to become re-centralized in order to become compliant. Right. And trying to take on the unique risks of these networks at the same time that you're trying to promote the unique properties of it is a really complex job that a lot of the regulators are spending a lot of time struggling with, and so it's thankfully it's an evolving space, and thankfully in most jurisdictions the regulators are taking a slow and incremental approach where, instead of trying to strangle everything at once, they try to take on the biggest, kind of most obvious items first, and then work their way down the list from there. So for example, they've taken on centralized exchanges and issuers of tokens as the first place to go because they sort of know how to regulate those. They look like traditional things. And they've said, look, industry, DeFi regulation is coming. Regulation around communication with unhosted wallets is coming. Be ready for it, right? We're going to be doing these things in the future. But we know we don't really 100% understand it yet. The industry doesn't 100% understand what the trade-offs are yet. It's not actually mature enough to know what the future is going to look like and where the risks really are. And so, let's figure out how we're going to build these regulations and move these things together. I think it's something I know that, Amit and his organization are great at, Ari and his organization are great at, is doing that engagement to help to ensure that those regulators and the lawmakers are up to speed, and that as these regulations move forward, they're taking these diverse needs into account.
Yeah.
I would just kind of jump in. I thought that was really, really well said. And it's interesting. I think what we're kind of getting at is that the same things that make crypto really and DeFi such a source of good, right? Permissionless, decentralized, cross-border value transfer at the speed of the internet also make it attractive to illicit actors. And it's been a really crazy year, right? I spent my entire career as a prosecutor, in this post 9/11 world that sort of Amit was referring to, standing up these huge, apparatus to combat, global terrorism. I think what we've seen is really the first sort of post 9/11 moment in our national security, and that is where illicit actors have sort of moved to a digital battlefield. I think it was sort of the wake-up call was really May 7th, the Colonial Pipeline attack, which could have been significantly worse. But I think what we've seen now is nation-state actors like North Korea engaging in cyber attacks, at scale. We've seen programmatic money laundering. We've seen terrorist financing in Bitcoin. And I think but the really extraordinary thing is there's technology, from all of our, really, which I think that all of us are sort of trying to bring to the table here that can allow visibility for law enforcement and regulators that they've never had before. And I think what typically what we're all doing is sort of saying to regulators, hey, look, we need to harness the power of this technology to regulate in the space. Law enforcement, I can tell you, are already harnessing the power of the technology in order to do investigations. Had the Colonial Pipeline attack, happened in fiat or prepaid debit cards or wire transfers, the FBI would never have been able to recover the ransom payment. And I think that it's really important, sort of what we're thinking about, sort of what regulations should look like, what policies should look like in this space. It's really understanding the technology that is available to law enforcement and regulators.
One of the extraordinary things about having the three of you up here that I think is incredibly exciting is to hear three people who are really embracing this technology, who see the opportunities, who see where the future is going, and simultaneously are saying, yes, but there are real challenges in terms of bad actors. One of the sort of recurring themes that I notice is this idea of trade-offs, of figuring out how these delicate balancing acts get performed. Give us a sense of where regulators and law enforcement are right now, in your view. You mentioned the potential risk of overreach. Give us a sense of where you think we are on that spectrum, on that continuum today, and where we're headed.
Sure. I mean, I'll give it a go to start. I think that on net, the number of policymakers and regulators at state-based level, at federal level, and internationally at the jurisdictional level, on net are much more forward-leaning on the embracing of the digital asset revolution and the capabilities that the underlying technology affords than have been ever before. That is not to say that the realities of potential overreach and the application of otherwise legacy architected, regulation will not need to evolve. I mean, let's remember. I mean, in 2001, post September 2001, the only toolkit we could go to combat terrorism finance was the anti-money laundering framework. Right. By definition, it's kind of a wacky frame because by definition, money laundering starts from the proceeds of a crime. But you can take very legitimate dollars and fund a terrorist organization, right? So it's backwards to but we're applying the same toolkit. And we're also asking organizations that were never set up as intelligence organizations and law enforcement organizations to do intelligence and law enforcement work. So, now you fast forward to organizations that are creating technologies that, when you think about the power of reach in the most remote places on the planet with 95% cell phone, mobile phone, and smartphone penetration rates, the access and ability to access economic resilience assets, to be able to store value, to be able to start a small business, to be able to send money to a relative that has a health event instantaneously is huge, especially in an environment where 2.5 to 3.5 billion people on the planet don't have access to basic financial services, and hundreds of millions of small businesses just can't get a small dollar loan, right? So we have to look at, on net, what is the risk of not embracing this technology? Yeah. And from a financial inclusion perspective, that's what I mean by overreach. We can't throw the babies out with the bathwater.